On October 15, 1857, nearly 3,000 people crowded around the gallows at Augusta County Jail to witness the hanging of James Copeland, a 34-year-old outlaw whose final confessions had shocked even the toughest lawmen. In his cell, he calmly detailed a string of murders so horrific that the court stenographer had to stop more than once to regain composure. Among the grisly evidence was a leather pouch filled with 43 human fingers, preserved in salt trophies Copeland had carried for over a decade. Each one told the story of a life ended along the Pearl River, where families learned to lock their doors at sundown in fear of his gang. How a promising young farmer became the South's most feared criminal remained a mystery until his deathbed confessions revealed truths the authorities had long tried to bury. Before we continue with Copeland's story and the terror he spread through the Pearl River Valley, remember this: channel dives into the darkest corners of American history, blending true crime with forgotten mysteries. If that fascinates you, subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, because your support helps keep these stories alive. The path that led James Copeland to the gallows began not with violence, but with what seemed like an innocent act of kindness that changed the course of his life forever. In the 1840s, Pearl River County, Mississippi was still on the edge of civilization. Thick cypress swamps stretched for miles, the river twisting through a wilderness where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral veils. The heavy air was filled with the hum of insects and the splash of alligators slipping beneath black water. The Copelands settled there in 1838 when James was 15. His father Samuel bought 200 acres of fertile bottomland from a retired fur trapper named Etienne Boudreau, including a worn farmhouse, a barn, and outbuildings that had seen better days. Samuel, a man known for his honesty and fairness, raised James alone after his wife Martha died, giving birth with help from his elderly sister Prudence. James grew into a strong and intelligent young man, able to read and write better than most men twice his age, yet also skilled enough to fell a tree or tame a horse with ease. Neighbors admired his sharp mind, his mother's gentle eyes, and his father's powerful hands. By the time he turned 19, he stood 6 feet tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, quickly becoming one of the most sought-after bachelors in the county. The Pearl River itself was the region's lifeline, carrying goods and news to and from New Orleans. But it also brought in gamblers, swindlers, and criminals who disappeared into the swamps after their schemes. Sheriff Thomas Bullock, a hardened veteran of the Creek Wars, struggled to enforce the law across 800 square miles of difficult terrain. It was in 1843, at a harvest festival in Columbia, the county seat, that James first met Elizabeth Hartwell, the daughter of Judge William Hartwell, one of Mississippi's most influential men. Elizabeth, with her auburn hair and striking green eyes, was admired for her beauty, but also for her intelligence and kindness. Despite the difference in social class, she showed genuine interest in James. Her father owned a large plantation with over 50 enslaved workers and wielded power through his connections across the state. Their courtship followed the customs of the day, but few could have guessed how quickly James's path would turn from love and promise to crime and terror. Every Sunday after church, James Copeland rode the 15 miles to Columbia, bringing small gifts for Elizabeth Hartwell and spending carefully watched hours with her at the family plantation. Judge Hartwell was cautious at first about his daughter courting a farmer's son, but over time, James' intelligence, charm, and devotion to Elizabeth softened his opinion. By the spring of 1844, neighbors expected an engagement announcement. That expectation shattered when a merchant named Calvin Richardson vanished on his way from Hattiesburg to Columbia. Richardson carried nearly $800 in gold to purchase land near the Hartwell estate. His horse was later found roaming near the Pearl River, but no trace of the man himself ever surfaced. Sheriff Bullock led search parties through the swamps for days, but they found nothing. Fear spread through the community, reminding everyone that life along the frontier was balanced on the edge of danger. James appeared deeply shaken by the disappearance. He joined every search, scouring riverbanks and swamps, and Elizabeth later recalled how distracted and withdrawn he became during this time. He often drifted off in conversation, as if his thoughts were haunted by something he dared not say. The truth about what happened to Calvin Richardson only came out 13 years later in Copeland's final confessions, whispered from his death cell. According to him, the fateful encounter began as a chance meeting. James had been checking his fish traps along the Pearl River one misty morning when the sound of hooves echoed through the cypress. Out of the fog came Richardson riding a chestnut mare and leading a mule heavy with supplies. The merchant looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as if chased. "Good morning, young man," he called with relief. "I've lost my way. Can you direct me to the Columbia Road?" James pointed toward a barely visible trail along the river, marked by a blazed oak. Before Richardson could continue, his horse stumbled, throwing him violently to the ground. His legs snapped with a sickening crack, bending at an unnatural angle. His screams tore through the swamp, sending birds flying from their roosts. James rushed to help, but Richardson gripped his arm and gasped, "Don't leave me. They're following me. Men who want to rob me. They've been on my trail since Hattiesburg." James quickly realized he was caught in a deadly dilemma. The man's injuries needed urgent care, but the nearest doctor was hours away, and carrying him would be nearly impossible through swamp thickets. As if on cue, the sound of galloping horses broke through the underbrush. 3 men appeared, rough and dangerous, scanning the riverbank. Their leader, a hulking figure with a gray beard named Gideon, barked orders while his younger companions studied the ground. "Trail goes cold here," one muttered. Gideon snarled, "He's hiding close. Richardson, come out and we'll make it quick. Make us hunt you and we'll take our time." Hidden among palmetto bushes, James supported the trembling merchant who whispered broken prayers through his agony. But the sound drew attention. One outlaw froze, head cocked like a hound on scent. "You hear that, Gideon? Someone praying?" Gideon's knife glinted in the sunlight as he growled, "Last chance, Richardson." At that moment, James faced an impossible choice. Stay hidden and watch an innocent man tortured to death, or reveal himself and share in the slaughter. The merchant's prayers grew louder, his voice ragged with pain, and James knew their hiding place was seconds from discovery. According to Copeland's own confession, what happened after Richardson's prayers gave away their hiding place unfolded in a blur that seemed both endless and instantaneous. With Gideon and his men prowling just yards away, James made his choice. Instead of revealing himself or risking a fight, he clamped his hand tightly over the injured merchant's mouth, silencing both words and breath. Richardson's wide, desperate eyes pleaded in terror, but his shattered leg left him powerless. James held firm until the man's body slackened, his heart pounding so violently he was sure the outlaws could hear it. When the struggle ended, he eased Richardson's lifeless body onto the damp earth, his own hands trembling with the weight of what he had done. The outlaws lingered for nearly an hour, circling and cursing before abandoning their hunt. Their hoofbeats faded into the swamp, leaving James alone with a corpse, and the awful knowledge that he had chosen his own survival over another man's life. The dead merchant's eyes seemed frozen in accusation, staring upward through the branches as though fixed on heaven. His mouth gaped in a silent scream that James could not escape. But horror soon gave way to temptation. Nearby, one of Richardson's saddlebags had split open, scattering gold coins across the mossy ground. James counted nearly $800, a fortune for a farmer's son, more than his family would see in 5 years. The realization struck like lightning. Richardson was gone with no close kin in Mississippi to come searching. The outlaws thought he had slipped away. The sheriff would likely blame bandits or wild beasts. If James hid the body and kept the money, no one would ever know. Yet a practical problem remained discovery. A body with a broken leg and a distinctive gold ring would tell a tale that might not fit the expected narrative. James reasoned that sooner or later suspicion would reach him. So he took Richardson's knife and for the first time mutilated a corpse. He cut away the merchant's ring finger, destroying the most identifiable clue. The act revolted him, but he performed it with a grim, unsettling calm, carefully wrapping the severed finger in a strip of shirt fabric and placing it in his pocket. Richardson's body he dragged to the river, weighted with stones, and pushed into a deep, alligator-haunted pool, where nature would erase the rest. James walked away with the gold, the knife, and that strange, grisly keepsake, the first of many. He told himself it was simply necessity, but in his heart he sensed the truth. A part of him had shifted irreversibly. For weeks afterward, he lived as though nothing had changed. He farmed the land and continued calling on Elizabeth, even using small amounts of the gold to repair the homestead. To his father, it looked like industry and ambition, the kind of initiative any parent would admire. Samuel never suspected the improvements were bought with blood. Elizabeth, though, began to notice something darker. James was more possessive, quicker to bristle when other men spoke to her. His once warm eyes now held a glint of coldness that unsettled her. When she mentioned it to her father, Judge Hartwell dismissed it as little more than the jealousy of young love. But the change was real, and it would surface again before the year was out. 5 months after Richardson's death, another man vanished, this time a preacher. Reverend Augustus Fleming, who had been traveling through Pearl River County leading revival meetings, was known to carry the generous offerings of his congregants destined for a new church in Mobile. Copeland admitted that Fleming's death was not planned, but rather the product of an opportunity that presented itself. The Reverend had stopped at the Copeland farm, watered his horse, and shared a meal with the family. It was a simple act of hospitality, but one that would end with another body, another stolen purse, and another step down the dark path James had already begun to walk. Samuel Copeland welcomed Reverend Fleming with the respect due a man of God, and the evening was filled with scripture readings and spirited talk of faith. By dawn, however, an offhand remark sealed the preacher's fate. As he saddled his horse, Fleming mentioned the $400 in donations he carried and asked James for advice on the safest route to Mobile. That single moment of trust awakened the same dark current that had driven James to silence Calvin Richardson. Eager and polite on the surface, James offered to guide the preacher through the swamp, promising a shortcut that would shave hours off the journey. Samuel blessed their trip, watching the pair vanish into the mist, never knowing he had witnessed Reverend Fleming's last ride. At a remote crossing, where an abandoned logging road met the river, James acted. With the preacher's back turned, he swung a heavy branch with brutal force. Fleming collapsed dazed and bleeding, and James finished the job with the same knife he had taken from Richardson. The horror he had once felt was gone, replaced by a cold, efficient detachment. He worked quickly, methodically, and before rolling Fleming's body into a deep pool of the Pearl River. He severed the right index finger, adding it to the cloth bundle that already held Richardson's. James still told himself this was about avoiding identification, but in truth, the fingers had become tokens proof of his control over life and death. News of the preacher's disappearance ignited panic across southern Mississippi. Fleming was beloved, his revivals drawing hundreds, and when word spread, entire congregations mobilized. Churches launched search parties, and the state itself offered a reward. Sheriff Thomas Bullock was hounded by community leaders demanding justice. Through it all, James played his role perfectly. He joined every search, waded through swamps with lantern in hand, and prayed loudly with the volunteers. Elizabeth Hartwell saw only a man of selfless character, and Samuel Copeland swelled with pride at his son's devotion to the cause. None of them suspected that the body they sought was already feeding the river's catfish. The investigation soon took a sharper edge. Bullock noticed a troubling pattern. Both Richardson and Fleming had been traveling with large sums of money. He warned surrounding counties of a possible band of highway robbers preying on wealthy travelers. This was a development James found unsettling. One missing man might vanish without raising alarm, but two, both carrying fortunes, would lead lawmen to connect dots. He realized he needed to be more cautious, to space out his killings and target men whose absences would stir less sympathy. By December of 1844, James put those lessons to use. His next victim was Marcus Kellerman, a slave trader despised by nearly everyone who knew him. Traveling north from New Orleans with 15 enslaved men and women bound for the markets of Natchez, Kellerman stopped near the Copeland farm when a wagon wheel splintered. Though Samuel Copeland bristled at the man's presence, hospitality on the frontier demanded he offer food and shelter. The night passed in uneasy company. Kellerman drank heavily, sneered at the Copelands, and boasted of the profits he would make from human flesh. With no shame, he displayed the bulging money belt at his waist, more than $600 in gold and silver, taunting the world with his cruelty and his greed. James Copeland watched Marcus Kellerman with a cold intensity torn between disgust at the man's cruelty and the growing hunger for his wealth. When Kellerman boasted that he would depart before dawn, James offered to guide him through a swamp path that promised to cut hours off the journey. What followed was the most savage killing yet. By now, James had grown confident in his methods. He toyed with the slave trader, inflicting pain and humiliation, before finally ending his life with grim finality. Afterward, he removed Kellerman's right middle finger for his grisly collection and pried the gold teeth from his mouth with pliers. A new level of brutality that revealed how far James had slipped into darkness. But Kellerman's human cargo presented a new problem. 15 enslaved people had seen James escort their master into the swamp. Their testimony could lead back to him. James resolved the matter with ruthless calculation. He drove them deeper into the wilderness, then abandoned them without food, water, or knowledge of the land. Most perished in the following days, falling to the swamp's merciless hazards, exposure, hunger, wild animals. Only 3 survived, and when they reached safety, they were captured, sold, and their desperate accounts dismissed as lies to cover an escape attempt. With their voices silenced, James was safe again. By the beginning of 1845, he had killed 6 people and amassed nearly $3,000 of fortune for the time. Beneath his floorboards, hidden away, was a leather pouch stuffed with severed fingers preserved in salt. What had begun as a precaution had become ritual. Each finger marked a life taken, and James handled them with a fascination that bordered on reverence. The killings had not gone unnoticed. Gideon McCriady, the gray-bearded outlaw whose pursuit of Richardson had sparked James's first crime, recognized the signs. As the leader of a ruthless gang operating across Louisiana and Mississippi, McCready saw in James both skill and promise. Through cautious meetings, he tested the young farmer's loyalty and ruthlessness. James impressed him not only for his intelligence and ability to hide in plain sight, but for the whispers of mutilation that followed him like smoke. A partnership formed. McCready gave James protection, guidance, and access to bigger targets. James in turn offered insider knowledge of the Pearl River country and the guise of a respectable farmer. Together they spread terror through the region. The severed fingers became James's calling card, a symbol of his growing reputation. Among criminals, he was no longer just a farmer gone bad. He was a figure to be feared, a killer whose trophies proved his power. Yet while his infamy grew in secret, his public life took a darker turn. In the spring of 1845, James formally proposed to Elizabeth Hartwell, and Judge Hartwell gave his blessing. The wedding was set for October. But Elizabeth began to feel unsettled by the man she was about to marry. His once warm gaze had hardened into something predatory. His words fewer but heavier, and his conversations often wandered into subjects of death and violence. He had taken to collecting knives, displaying them with a strange pride that unnerved her. The breaking point came in August of that year, when James, alongside Macready's gang, carried out their most audacious crime. Yet the ambush of the riverboat Southern Belle, laden with passengers, including families with young children, and a cargo hold of valuable goods, the vessel steamed toward Columbia. James had studied its schedule, scouted the river, and chosen the perfect spot, a tight bend where the current forced the boat close to shore. At his signal, Macready's men swarmed from both banks, boarding with ruthless efficiency and overwhelming the crew before anyone could mount a defense. What happened aboard the Southern Belle was not just a robbery, it was slaughter on a scale that even hardened criminals whispered about in disbelief. Macready's gang executed their plan with precision. But once control of the vessel was secure, the operation dissolved into chaos and bloodshed. Every passenger was stripped of valuables, then killed without mercy, whether man, woman, or child. James himself cut down 3 people, including a young mother bound for Columbia to attend her sister's wedding. From her, he claimed another finger for his grisly pouch, along with her wedding band and pearl necklace. The massacre marked a turning point. For James, it was no longer about money or survival. It was about power. The act awakened something dark and insatiable, transforming him fully from reluctant killer into willing predator. For the community, the Southern Belle massacre brought unprecedented outrage. When the charred wreckage was discovered 3 days later, federal marshals from New Orleans were called in. Even the Mississippi legislature opened special funds to reward informants. Suddenly, Sheriff Bullock was no longer leading a small-town investigation. He was working alongside men with resources, networks, and determination far beyond his means. The pressure forced James to tighten the mask of respectability. Outwardly, he was still the dutiful son and devoted fiancé. But Elizabeth noticed troubling cracks. He talked in his sleep, muttering names she didn't recognize, sometimes crying out in terror. When she pressed him, he brushed it off as nerves about their wedding. Samuel, too, observed his son's irritability and long absences, but he chalked it up to responsibility and ambition, believing James was securing financing for farm equipment. In reality, those absences were filled with more killings, more fingers salted away beneath the floorboards. The facade crumbled a dozen years later, in October of 1857, when James Copeland sat in the death cell of Augusta County Jail. Sheriff William Henderson had been probing him for weeks, using every trick in the book. Pleas, threats, promises, without success. James sat like a statue, silent, unreadable. Henderson was close to giving up when he mentioned a name. Elizabeth Hartwell, now. Elizabeth Camden, married to a lawyer in Columbia. The effect was immediate. James's stoic mask shattered. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook, and tears streamed down his scarred face. "Elizabeth," he whispered, as if the name itself were holy. "Sweet, beautiful Elizabeth. Does she know what I became?" Henderson seized the moment, speaking softly, reminding James that she remembered him as the young farmer she once loved. If he told the truth, perhaps she could still remember him that way. The dam broke. For 3 days, Henderson sat by the iron bars while James poured out confessions that filled nearly 200 pages. He spoke of 47 murders across Mississippi and Louisiana between 1844 and 1856, each retold with chilling detail. What began, he said, was not greed or cruelty, but love, a desperate attempt to rise above the mud, to be worthy of Elizabeth. But each choice, each crime pulled him further from her, until all that remained was blood, bone, and fingers preserved in salt. James Copeland's confession unfolded like a lecture delivered by a man who believed himself less a murderer than a craftsman. Sheriff Henderson, his hand cramping from pages of notes, listened as James recounted each killing with unnerving clarity. He began with Calvin Richardson, not glossing over the moral struggle but savoring it. "I held my hand over his mouth and felt his life drain beneath my palm," he said in a distant, almost dreamlike voice. "And in that instant, I discovered something within myself. I had the power to choose who lived and who died. That power was sweeter than any whiskey or laudanum." He explained his ritual of severed fingers, tracing its origins from necessity to obsession. At first, he had removed them to conceal identities. But soon each digit became a symbol, a narrative locked in flesh. He kept them categorized, turning his pouch of salted remains into a grim library of death. This one, he told Henderson, lifting a finger wrapped in cloth, was from a merchant who whimpered until the end. This one belonged to a preacher who cursed me with his dying breath. And this was taken from a mother who fought like a wildcat to protect her children before I silenced her. The most shocking moment came when James offered to lead the sheriff and federal marshals to his hiding place. At low water, they followed him to a small island in the Pearl River, shaded by cypress trees draped in moss, where a cave yawned like a mouth into darkness. Inside, lantern light revealed a collection that chilled even the most seasoned lawmen. In a leather case lay 43 preserved fingers, meticulously labeled and arranged. But that was only the beginning. There were written logs describing every murder, in painstaking detail maps marked with death sites, sketches of victims, notes on valuables stolen, and records of their final words. The cave also contained trinkets taken from the dead watch's wedding bands, religious medals, lockets with tiny portraits. Each item was a memory stolen from grieving families, transformed into a token of Copeland's dominion. Most disturbing of all were the journals. In them, James analyzed his work with academic precision, writing about his state of mind, comparing techniques, and noting improvements for future killings. He even studied other murders, adapting what he learned like a scholar refining a discipline. One journal categorized victim psychology, how the brave cursed, how the terrified prayed, how the resigned simply begged. He had developed strategies for each treating murder as a science to be perfected. Federal Marshal Robert Thornbury, a veteran of 30 years, stood in the cave, and later admitted, "I had seen many things, but never a monument to evil such as this." The records provided answers to unsolved disappearances that had plagued communities along the Mississippi River for years. Yet the true horror was not just in the numbers or trophies, but in the systematic nature of Copeland's terror. For more than a decade, families had locked their doors at sundown. Travelers had avoided the Pearl River roads, and towns had whispered of a phantom menace that now had a face. What emerged from the confession was the portrait of a man who had abandoned his humanity piece by piece, trading conscience for control. He described his killings with the detachment of a tradesman. No remorse in his voice, only the measured pride of a professional. "I became what I needed to become," he told Henderson, gripping the bars of his cell as though the words themselves steadied him. And for 3 long days, the sheriff wrote as quickly as his pen allowed, capturing the legacy of a man who had turned death into both an art and an addiction. James Copeland's trial was as much theater as it was justice. a spectacle that gripped the South. His philosophy, articulated in both confession and testimony, was chilling in its clarity. "Society creates its monsters," he said flatly. "I simply had the courage to take what I wanted, rather than accept the limits that others imposed." His words, delivered without remorse, landed like hammer blows in a courtroom already straining under the weight of horror. Behind closed doors, Elizabeth Hartwell Camden, once the woman James sought to impress with wealth and status, gave testimony that revealed the slow unraveling of his mind during their courtship. She spoke of subtle shifts, how compassion turned into contempt, how James began dismissing the poor as weak and praising the rich as superior. She remembered the moment that chilled her to the core when he told her that the world belonged to men bold enough to take what they wanted. At the time, she thought it a metaphor for business ambition. Only later did she understand that James had already crossed into bloodshed. Her testimony was devastating, underscoring that Copeland's descent into violence had begun long before his crimes became notorious. The courtroom itself became a stage for one of the most infamous trials of the century. Newspapers from Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans sent correspondents who published daily accounts of the proceedings, and the hotels of Augusta County overflowed with spectators. People traveled for days to see the man whose crimes had terrorized entire counties. Families of victims wept openly in the gallery, while curiosity seekers leaned forward hungry for lurid detail. Judge Harrison Pembroke, a seasoned jurist with decades of experience handling riots, political assassinations, and slave uprisings, confessed privately that he had never encountered such evil. This man, he told colleagues, destroyed lives not from passion or necessity, but from cold calculation. He treated human beings as obstacles to be removed. Our courts were never designed to try a creature such as this. James's court-appointed defense attorney, Robert Sinclair, was young and inexperienced, pressed into service because no established lawyer would touch the case. He attempted to mount an insanity defense, calling in prominent alienists from as far away as Philadelphia. Dr. Hamilton Breenidge testified that James suffered from constitutional moral deficiency, a state in which a man possessed intelligence but no capacity for empathy or guilt. Breenidge insisted that such individuals were driven by compulsion, not choice. But the prosecution dismantled this argument with ease. Copeland's careful journals, his maps, his trophies, all spoke of premeditation. This was no wild frenzy of madness, they argued, but the deliberate work of a calculating mind. Most damning of all, James himself rejected the insanity plea. When he rose to speak, the packed courtroom fell silent. "I am not insane," he said, his voice steady. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I chose to kill. I planned it, executed it, and profited by it. If that makes me a monster, then so be it. But do not diminish what I did by pretending I was unaware." District Attorney Charles Waverly, ambitious and razor-sharp, had spent months preparing for this moment. He recognized that convicting Copeland would cement his name in legal history. With theatrical precision, he presented the evidence, the pouch of fingers, the journals, the maps, the confessions. Piece by piece, he wove a narrative of a man who had worn the mask of a respectable farmer and fiancé while secretly orchestrating a campaign of terror. He spared the jury the most grotesque details, but left no doubt about the enormity of Copeland's crimes. By the time he finished, there was little room for mercy and even less for doubt. The climax of James Copeland's trial was District Attorney Charles Waverly's closing argument, a performance remembered for years as one of the finest examples of Southern courtroom oratory. For nearly 4 hours, Waverly held the jury spellbound as he traced James's descent from hard-working farm boy to calculating killer. He rejected the notion of madness instead framing Copeland's acts as deliberate choices made with full awareness of their consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he declared, his voice rising above the packed chamber, "you have heard crimes so heinous they shake our very faith in human nature. James Copeland is not the victim of disease or misfortune. He is a man who chose evil eyes wide open and reveled in it. He murdered 47 souls, not from necessity, but from the cold belief that their lives were worth less than his greed." The jury needed little convincing. They deliberated less than 2 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. Thomas Whitfield, the foreman, later remarked to reporters, "It was one of the simplest decisions I've ever made. The only question was whether justice demanded the rope, and we all agreed it did." Judge Pembroke pronounced sentence with solemn gravity, death by hanging to be carried out on October 15, 1857. James listened with the same calm he had displayed throughout the proceedings, nodding slightly as though the verdict confirmed what he already knew. When asked if he wished to speak, he rose and delivered his final words to the court. "I have received the justice I deserve. I do not ask for mercy, nor do I deny the crimes for which I stand convicted. Let my fate be a warning there is no treasure worth the price of a man's soul." In the weeks that followed, James became unexpectedly cooperative with Sheriff Henderson. He spent his last days drawing maps, recounting details, and leading search parties to hidden burial grounds across Mississippi and Louisiana. Entire families were unearthed from shallow graves, including the Patterson family of 4 children among them, whose remains lay hidden for more than a decade. For some grieving relatives, the discoveries brought long-awaited closure. For others, only fresh torment. Henderson himself grew wary of interpreting these acts as redemption. He did not seek forgiveness, the sheriff later wrote in his memoir. He savored the retelling, as though reliving each crime gave him purpose again. He described his murders with the pride of a man recounting victories, not sins. Until almost the eve of his execution, Copeland continued to guide investigators, exposing the scale of his crimes. Bodies buried beneath fallen logs, skeletons sunk in cypress swamps, mass graves concealed under tangled thickets. His maps transformed folklore into fact, giving names to mysteries that had haunted communities for years. And with each revelation, the legend of James Copeland grew darker still less, the story of a man who lost his way, and more the tale of someone who embraced monstrosity as his chosen craft. The discovery of the Patterson family's mass grave was one of the darkest chapters of James Copeland's final confessions. A Georgia family bound for Texas, they had paused along the Pearl River Road and welcomed a stranger into their camp. James had presented himself as a traveling minister, his voice soft with scripture, his manner humble. They shared food, trusted his blessing, and never realized that beneath the pious mask lay a predator. They never even understood what was happening. He told Sheriff Henderson with a trace of almost tender memory. For $47 and a gold pocket watch, he slit the throats of parents and children alike, the youngest only 3 years old, Elizabeth Hartwell Camden. Once his fiancée, and by then long married to another, never saw James again. Yet 3 days before his execution, she sent a letter to the jail chaplain. Written in her delicate hand on rose-scented paper, it spoke of forgiveness. She confessed that for 12 years she had wrestled with the contradiction between the gentle young farmer she had loved and the monster described in the press. Prayer had brought her to peace. I choose to remember the James Copeland who brought me wild flowers and spoke of dreams for our future, she wrote. That man existed, if only briefly. I believe that somewhere deep inside you, a fragment of him still remains. I pray you will find him again before your final judgment. When Reverend Samuel Morrison read the letter aloud to James on the eve of his hanging, Witnesses said the outlaw broke at last. Tears streaked his weathered face. The chaplain noted it was the only time he had seen James show unguarded emotion, but even he could not say if the tears were for his victims or for the life he had thrown away. Copeland dictated a reply that sprawled across 8 pages. He apologized for the pain he had caused, begged Elizabeth to remember the boy he had once been, rather than the killer he had become, and admitted that thoughts of her had haunted him through every crime. "You were the angel I was never worthy to touch," he told her. "Every life I took pulled me further from the light you represented, and deeper into the darkness that consumed me. If there is justice in this world, you will forget me and live the happiness my choices destroyed." In his final weeks, Samuel Copeland came to visit his son twice. The elderly farmer, already frail from years of labor, seemed to shrink under the weight of revelation. He could not reconcile the boy he had raised, the boy who once sang hymns at his mother's grave, with the calculating killer in shackles before him. The meetings aged him visibly. During their last conversation, Samuel pleaded with James to tell him where he had gone wrong as a father. James's voice softened, and for the first time in years, he spoke without defiance. "You did nothing wrong, Father," he said. "You raised me with love, and you taught me right from wrong as clearly as any man could. The choices were mine. The blame is mine. Do not carry my sins along with your grief." But Samuel could not accept it. The old man left the cell, broken, his heart heavy with questions no confession could answer. James Copeland's story ended in a spectacle that blurred the line between justice and morbid fascination. His father, Samuel, did not live long enough to escape the shadow of his son's crimes. Less than a year after the hanging, the old man was dead, and many in the county believed shame and grief had finished what time alone could not. His farm was sold off to cover debts, and the new owners razed the family home, declaring no decent soul could sleep under the roof that had raised such evil. October 15th, 1857 dawned with the rumble of thousands gathering in Augusta County. Nearly 3,000 people swarmed the jail yard and surrounding fields, some having camped for days to secure their place. Vendors hawked food and trinkets. Photographers prepared their equipment to immortalize the day. Inside, James ate his last breakfast: eggs, bacon, and coffee, without hurry or hesitation, while Reverend Morrison read from Scripture. He asked for no special meal, saying simple food was most fitting. When pressed about regrets, he spoke after a long silence. "I regret the pain I caused those who loved me. I regret wasting the gifts God gave me. But I do not regret the choices, for they were mine. To regret them now would be to deny the very essence of who I became." At 10:30, escorted by Sheriff Henderson and 2 marshals, he refused the hood and walked steadily to the scaffold. The crowd hushed as he mounted the 13 steps. Even the vendors fell silent. At the platform's edge, he addressed the mass of faces with a voice that carried across the square. "I have confessed my crimes and accepted my punishment. Let my death be a warning. There is no treasure worth the price of a man's soul, and no gold can buy peace for a conscience soaked in innocent blood. I go to my death with hope that my example spares others from this path." The hangman, brought in from New Orleans, adjusted the rope and asked if he wished to speak again. James shook his head, closed his eyes, and appeared to pray. At 11:47 a.m., the trap was sprung. His neck snapped instantly. Dr. Henry Caldwell pronounced him dead minutes later, though his body hung another quarter hour to ensure finality. He was lowered into a plain pine coffin built by the jail carpenter and carried quietly to an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Only Reverend Morrison and 2 hired gravediggers witnessed the burial. Officials kept the site secret, fearing it would become either a shrine or a scavenger's quarry. As a final act, the symbols of his crimes were destroyed. The pouch of 43 human fingers, his grotesque ledger of death, was burned in a solemn ceremony, attended by lawmen from across the South. Sheriff Henderson struck the match himself, and the crowd of officials stood silent as the salted trophies hissed and cracked until nothing remained but ash and bone dust. The ashes of Copeland's grisly trophies were cast into the Pearl River, a symbolic act meant to return the victims to the same waters where so many of their bodies had been discarded. With that fire and scattering, the last physical remnants of his crimes were gone. But the psychological scars lingered for decades. Families shattered by his violence struggled to move on, and in many homes, the grief was never fully healed. Sheriff Henderson himself never recovered from the ordeal. 6 months after the execution, he retired from law enforcement, saying the case had aged him beyond his years and robbed him of faith in human nature. He resettled with his family in California, where he became a farmer and deliberately avoided all contact with crime for the rest of his life. Though he never again spoke publicly about Copeland, his detailed memoir, published after his death in 1893, gave future generations a first-hand account of the horrors he had witnessed. The trial transcripts and confession notes were sealed for more than 50 years, ensuring that the full story of the Pearl River murders remained hidden until 1910, when they were finally made public. Their release caused a sensation among criminologists, who hailed them as one of the most complete records of serial murder ever uncovered. Dr. Hamilton Breenidge, the Philadelphia alienist who had testified at trial, had already used the case to publish a groundbreaking study in 1862 on what he called moral insanity. His work laid early foundations for modern forensic psychiatry and the emerging science of criminal profiling. Copeland's case also transformed law enforcement across the South. It exposed the weakness of fragmented jurisdictions and pushed sheriffs to develop better systems for sharing records and tracking suspects. For the first time, counties began maintaining detailed files on unsolved crimes and exchanging information with neighbors, a practice that closed dozens of cases in the decades that followed. Investigators also learned to study patterns, recognizing that repeat offenders often left signatures behind. Ironically, Copeland's meticulous journals, his own pride in his craft, helped shape early investigative methods and provided insights into the psychology of killers that remain valuable today. Over time, the Pearl River region recovered, though memories of fear were passed down through generations. Older residents never forgot the years when families barred their doors at sundown and travelers avoided the swamp roads for fear of meeting the man who collected fingers as trophies. Even now, more than 150 years later, his name is spoken with unease in Mississippi. Historical markers stand at sites tied to his crimes, and the cave where he hid his collection has become a grim attraction for those fascinated by the darker corners of American history. The James Copeland case remains one of the best documented examples of serial murder in the 19th century. A story that reminds us how fragile civilization can be, how quickly ambition can curdle into savagery, and how vital it is for society to remain vigilant against those who prey on the defenseless. It also stands as proof of the importance of psychology in criminal investigation, and the determination of lawmen, no matter how shaken, to bring justice for the innocent. So what do you think? Did Copeland truly confess to everything? Or might there be more victims whose names and bones were lost forever in the swamps? And how would a case like his be handled today, with forensic science, DNA testing, and modern criminal profiling? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story chilled you, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and pass it along to someone who loves dark mysteries. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing the forgotten crimes of America's past, grim reminders of the evil that lurks in the human heart. See you in the next video.